In the shadows of a war, beneath the canopy of dense forests, a silent enemy was unleashed. Agent Orange rained down upon Vietnam, its mission to strip the Viet Cong of their natural cover and kill off crops and food supplies. But the war against nature had an unintended casualty: human life. The land, once a tapestry of biodiversity, turned into a desolate echo of its former self. The true horror of Agent Orange was not immediate, it was a creeping terror, manifesting in the lives of millions. The forests were not the only things that withered. Lives crumbled under the weight of deformities, diseases like leukemia, lymphoma, and a plethora of cancers unheard of before the war. These birth defects and diseases have impacted generation upon generation of victims over the past 50 years. More generations later, and still there are children born with extra toes, missing fingers or even eyes. The realities are truly horrific. US imperialists are waging germ warfare on Asians. This is how a senior US official feared the United States would be judged when he wrote this memo to the director of the United States Information Agency in November 1961. Later that same month, after a couple of months of test runs, John F. Kennedy authorized Operation Ranch Hand, a decade-long program to rain millions of gallons of toxic dioxins from the sky. Over 72,000 million litres of toxic defoliants were sprayed across massive areas of Vietnam. It's estimated that over 20,000 square kilometres of forest and 2,000 square kilometres of food-producing crops were destroyed. But what were the objectives? Why did this feel necessary? And more significantly, what are the terrible effects that we still witness today? Since its split from the Communist North in 1954, the US had been providing weapons, funding and training to the pro-Western government of South Vietnam, who were in an ongoing battle with the North and some of their own people in the South who favoured unification of the country. After 6 years of this, it became apparent that it isn't going to be enough, and the insurgency in the South is gaining significant momentum. The Kennedy-led administration had inherited the Cold War policies from Truman and Eisenhower and was simultaneously facing 4 crises. The failure of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. This was a failed US-funded military landing of groups in an attempt to overthrow Cuba's communist leader Fidel Castro. The ongoing heated negotiations between pro-Western movements and communist movements in Laos. The construction of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is still considered the moment the Cold War came closest to entering full-scale nuclear war, with Western nukes positioned in Italy and Turkey pointed at Russia, mirroring nuclear warheads pointed at the US from the shores of Cuba. So it was against this background of a war of global ideologies between capitalism and communism, alongside tense nuclear brinksmanship, that the US political elite are concerned that they will lose influence in the region and globally due to what was called the domino theory. The theory goes that if communism took hold in Vietnam, then it would continue to topple democracies all throughout the region and further. This was seen as a major threat to American influence and interests across the globe. The terrain of South Vietnam caused major challenges to the US and their advanced military equipment. Swamps, rice paddies, steep mountains, and most importantly the dense jungles and forests gave the guerrillas of the Viet Cong cover and camouflage that allowed them to hide in wait, ready to ambush South Vietnamese and US soldiers carrying their more advanced heavy equipment. The US needed a solution that made it harder for their enemies and made it easier to locate and eliminate the indigenous Viet Cong. In the 1950s, when present-day Malaysia was still the British colony of Malay, the British Imperial Army had utilised planes to deploy defoliant chemicals in the Malay jungles. This stripped the trees of its foliage and removed the camouflage that the communist guerrillas used to hide from the British troops. It also had the added effect of destroying crops that the Malay forces relied on for sustenance. Now, just a decade later, the US finds itself in similar circumstances in South Vietnam and decide to follow the British playbook on an enormous scale. As well as the dissenting voices from some officials, there were also warnings from scientists and chemical production companies alike that these toxins had potentially horrific consequences, but these were either ignored or deemed acceptable. Britain had already set a precedent that could be followed. In normal agricultural use, these chemicals were used as regular herbicides, but as a weapon of the war in Vietnam, various mixtures were used at up to 50 times the normal concentration levels. Over the next decade, nearly 19 million gallons were rained down on Vietnam, exposing an estimated 4 million Vietnamese as well as US soldiers. This war against nature had an unintended casualty: human life. The land, once a tapestry of biodiversity, turned into a desolate echo of its former self. Later in the video, we'll explore some of the devastating consequences these chemicals had on villagers, US soldiers and veterans, as well as Viet Cong, so stay with us. These truly horrific images cannot help but elicit disgust in anyone who witnesses this legacy. The land, once fertile, now holds the scars of a war waged not just with guns and bombs, but with chemicals. The soil, the rivers, the very DNA of the people, altered irrevocably. Agent Orange was more than a weapon against a hidden enemy. It became a lingering spectre, haunting generations, a tragic testament to the unseen costs of war. Was this a legitimate tactic? Did the strategists back in Washington know this would happen? As we get deeper into the story, we'll see what the legacy of these tactics were. Remember that senior United States Information Agency official who feared that the US would be remembered as US imperialists waging germ warfare on Asians? Was he right? Put your comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. In the corridors of scientific research, where curiosity often leads to unexpected discoveries, Arthur Galston's work in plant biology charted a course that would inadvertently alter the course of history. Galston's research was aimed at understanding how plants grow. In some of his early research at the University of Illinois, he discovers that a small dose of 2,3,5-triiodobenzoic acid could speed up the flowering of soybeans, but a strong dose caused the plants to completely defoliate and die. Arthur wasn't aware of it at the time, but he had just given life to what would become a highly controversial weapon of war. The herbicide he discovered was adapted by others into Agent Orange. As part of the production process of Agent Orange, there was a toxic byproduct called TCDD that persisted in the final mixture. This byproduct has been identified as the dioxin most responsible for the harmful effects to humans. When Galston learned of how his scientific findings were being used, his reaction was one of horror and disbelief. He had envisioned his work contributing to the betterment of humanity, not its destruction. The realization that his research was causing environmental devastation and untold human suffering propelled him into action. Galston began to speak out vehemently against the use of Agent Orange. He wasn't just a scientist in a lab anymore, he became a crusader for ethical science. He presented his findings on the damaging effects of the herbicide, not only on plants, but also on humans and the environment. His reports detailed the emergence of diseases, birth defects, and the environmental damage that were direct consequences of Agent Orange. His fight was not an easy one. The military was heavily invested in the use of Agent Orange, and Galston's opposition put him at odds with powerful interests. Despite this, he refused to be silenced. He argued passionately at scientific gatherings, in governmental hearings and through publications, stressing the moral responsibility scientists have towards humanity. Galston's efforts contributed to the growing awareness and condemnation of Agent Orange. His relentless advocacy played a crucial role in the eventual cessation of its use. Lyndon Johnson would not answer his letters, but eventually, with the accumulation of evidence, Richard Nixon eventually agreed, and in 1970, the spraying of Agent Orange was terminated. However, the damage had already been done. The landscapes of Vietnam were ravaged and the health of millions was compromised. In the later years of his life, Arthur Galston reflected on his role in the chapter of history. He often spoke about the ethical dimensions of scientific research, emphasizing that the pursuit of knowledge should always be tempered with consideration for its impact on human life and the environment. In a 2003 Yale Scientific article, Galston was quoted as saying, "I thought it was a misuse of science. Science is meant to improve the lot of mankind, not diminish it, and its use as a military weapon I thought was ill-advised." In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, a contentious debate emerged over the legality of the United States' use of Agent Orange. This debate not only questioned the adherence to international laws, but also shed light on the profound ethical implications of chemical warfare. At the heart of the controversy was whether Agent Orange, primarily used as a defoliant to clear dense vegetation, could be classified as a chemical weapon. The US government maintained that Agent Orange was a tactical herbicide, not intended to harm humans but to impede the enemy's cover and food supply. However, the reality on the ground painted a different picture. Agent Orange, laden with dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals known to man, wreaked havoc on the Vietnamese people and environment. The Vietnam Red Cross estimated that 3 million Vietnamese, including 150,000 children, were afflicted by diseases and disabilities linked to dioxin exposure. The international community grappled with the US's position. In 1967, thousands of American scientists, including Nobel laureates, denounced the use of Agent Orange as chemical and biological warfare. Subsequently, in 1969, the United Nations passed a resolution outlawing herbicides under the 1925 Geneva Convention. Professor Arthur Galston, whose early research contributed to the development of Agent Orange, coined the term ecocide. to describe the extensive ecological and human damage caused by the US defoliation campaign in Vietnam. This term underscored the interconnectedness in environmental destruction and human suffering. Despite these condemnations, the US legal stance remained steadfast. The US had not ratified the 1925 Geneva Protocol prior to 1975, arguing that it was not bound by its stipulations during the Vietnam War. Additionally, the US contended that the 1907 Hague Convention only banned toxic chemicals, not defoliants like Agent Orange. This legal interpretation was pivotal in the dismissal of a class action lawsuit filed in 2004 by the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange against chemical manufacturers in the US Federal District Court in New York. The legal and ethical ramifications of the US's use of Agent Orange continue to be a subject of intense debate. The controversy underscores a broader issue in warfare, a fine line between tactical advantage and humanitarian disaster. In the quiet hamlets of Vietnam, a silent and relentless tragedy unfolds, marked not by the clamour of war, but by the hushed whispers of suffering. Here, the legacy of Agent Orange is etched deeply into the lives of its most innocent victims, the children, born with devastating birth defects, direct consequences of a war they never saw. Picture a child born decades after the guns fell silent, yet bearing the heavy scars of battle. Their body ravaged by spina bifida, a spinal defect so severe that walking is a distant dream, a life confined to the perpetual support of braces or a wheelchair. These children, with their eyes and fragile bodies, are living reminders of the war's insidious reach. In another home, a young child struggles with the complexities of cerebral palsy, her limbs betraying her, refusing coordination and grace. Her voice, a tool for expression, is jarringly absent, stolen by a condition that emerged from her mother's unwitting exposure to the toxic dioxin. Her silent world is a stark testament to the far-reaching effects of Agent Orange. As we work further into this landscape of lingering sorrow, we meet children grappling with hydrocephalus, commonly known as water on the brain. Their heads swollen, bearing the weight of excess fluid. Each day is a battle against pain and physical limitations. The simple joys of childhood, running, playing, learning, are overshadowed by the ever-present need for medical care and constant threat of life-threatening complications. The tragedy of Agent Orange is not just in these debilitating conditions, but also in the way they ripple through families. Parents, many of whom were children during the war, now face the heart-wrenching reality of caring for their afflicted offspring, often with limited resources and support. Their lives are consumed by hospital visits, caregiving, and an unending fight for their children's dignity and quality of life. This is the human cost of Agent Orange, a cost paid not in the currency of war, but in the currency of human health and potential. It's a poignant reminder of the lasting consequences of chemical warfare, a reminder that even after the battlefields have quieted, the echoes of war continue to reverberate through the lives of those who had no part in the conflict. The legacy of Agent Orange is written in the struggles of these children and their families, a legacy that speaks of unspeakable suffering and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. As the world continues to reckon with the legacy of Agent Orange, the episode remains a stark reminder of the need for stringent ethical standards in both scientific research and military strategy. Whilst the US government seems to have managed to delicately get to the other side of its legal tightrope, for me personally, after reviewing the details of all the information that was available at the time, I'm not sure that history judges the use of Agent Orange as morally legitimate. But that's just my opinion. I'd love to know what you think. Regardless of my personal opinion, the story of Agent Orange is a somber narrative. It teaches us the importance of responsibility, not just in the throes of war, but in the actions we take and the decisions we make. It reminds us that in pursuit of our own interests, we must never lose sight of our humanity. Agent Orange's legacy is a call to remember, to learn, and to ensure that such mistakes are not repeated in history. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to support more content like this, then please do subscribe to the channel, and lots of great topics for us to get into this year. Thanks.